Welcome to our series of 10 podcasts on EU foreign affairs under the Jean Monnet Chair Springboard Brussels 2015. My name is Sebastian Oberthür. I am the Academic Director of the Institute for European Studies at the Vrije Universiteit Brussels. Today's topic, to start off the series, will be the EU's role in international climate politics. In 2014, times have changed, and we'll explore the subject in 3 steps. First, I want to go a little bit into the history of international climate politics and the role of the EU in it, so that we know where we are coming from. Second, I want to explore a few of the driving forces that determine the role of the EU in international climate politics. And third, I want to take a look ahead and look at the current discussions that are ongoing at the international level and in the EU on international climate protection towards the year 2030 and beyond, and the 2015 Global Climate Agreement. And there are intense discussions that have been launched within the EU, and we'll touch upon those at the end. So the first step, where are we coming from as regards the role of the EU in international climate politics? I especially want to distinguish 2 aspects. The first is the actual goals of the EU in international climate cooperation, and the second is to what extent the EU has achieved these goals. As to the goals, it's obviously important to know, is the EU a progressive player? Does it go along with the science and press for international climate protection measures that are in line with science and would prevent dangerous interference with the climate system, as is the objective that's written down in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that was adopted in 1992 and has remained the basis of international climate cooperation ever since. Let's look back a little bit in history. Let's not go back to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992, but let's look at the Kyoto Protocol, which was adopted in 1997 and was afterwards elaborated further in the years afterwards until 2001, roughly. The second step would be the Copenhagen Climate Summit in 2009, where the discussion was about climate protection measures towards 2020, whereas what was dealt with in the Kyoto Protocol was really climate protection towards around 2010. And in the third step, we have the current discussions that I mentioned before about climate protection towards the year 2030. The EU traditionally has been called a leader in international climate cooperation, also because it was one of the most progressive forces, especially among developed countries. In the Kyoto Protocol negotiations in 1997, it was favoring relatively deep cuts in the emissions of greenhouse gases. It was favoring a cut of 15% below 1990 levels by the year 2010. It was not completely successful in getting that, but it did get an overall reduction in the greenhouse gas emissions of developed countries in the Kyoto Protocol of about 5% below 1990 levels. It itself, it took a target of minus 8% by 2010, roughly. So it was among the most progressive, when you compare it especially also to the US, to Japan, to Russia, what they put on the table. It was by far the most progressive in those terms. Towards Copenhagen, that situation roughly remained the same. There was a little bit of a change of the international context, to which I will come back later, in the sense that developing countries in Copenhagen played a much more prominent role than before, because Copenhagen 2009 was not only about developed country commitments and cuts in greenhouse gas emissions, as was Kyoto and the Kyoto Protocol, but about global cuts and cuts by developed countries as well as developing countries. In the Copenhagen negotiations, the EU again was very ambitious, very progressive, and very much in line with science. Scientists said that developed countries should by 2020 reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by roughly 25 to 40% below 1990 levels. And that was all with a view to limiting global warming to 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels within the next century or so. The EU put on the table a commitment to reduce its emissions by 20% in any event, and by 30% if other developed countries took on similar targets, and if developing countries, and especially the more advanced economies among them, would also take reasonable action and invest a comparative effort. Again, the EU was with this, as I said, the most progressive force. The US had lower ambitions, other developed countries had lower ambitions, and developing countries were first not really eager to put on the table any binding commitments. And the measures that were put on the table did not really amount to economy-wide emission reduction commitments. So the EU was very progressive. It wanted a new international agreement also in Copenhagen, a new international treaty that would bind all parties, developing as well as developed countries. When we now look at the current situation and the discussions about 2030, we may see that the EU may have lost a little bit of its momentum that it had before, although current indication would be that it is still, in relative terms, relatively advanced when compared with other major players on the scene. But we'll return to that later on when we are coming to the 2030 targets and looking ahead to those. When we now look at the goal achievement of the EU, so we had the goals, which were relatively progressive in Kyoto, which were very progressive in Copenhagen, and may have become a little bit more and less ambitious, towards 2030 now. What about the goal achievement? As I said, the EU had these targets in the Kyoto negotiations of minus 15% for developed countries, came out with -5%, which was still more than what other countries and participants wanted. So it was kind of, yes, some level of goal achievement, if not the full objective that they had. In Copenhagen 2009, the situation had changed, and it was afterwards, even by some EU politicians, called a disaster, because there was not the international treaty that the EU had aspired. There were no commitments by all major economies to reduce or limit greenhouse gas emissions, and a lot of the targets of the EU were not achieved. The EU therefore stayed with its minus 20% target, didn't go up to minus 30% as it had envisaged to do if other countries come along. So most of the literature agrees that EU goal achievement in Copenhagen was relatively low. And that's something that we are still grappling with when thinking about the role of the EU in international climate politics, how that came about, and how to prevent that in the future, that occurs again. Let's perhaps then turn towards the driving forces, and let's try to understand what's driving these developments. We have, first of all, the international context that I already alluded to, where we have to see that context has, since Kyoto in 1997 towards today, 2014, changed very much, and it continues to change. What we had in Kyoto and in the discussions after Kyoto was a situation where, as I mentioned before, we were internationally especially discussing commitments of developed countries. If we then look at the situation, who in that discussion are the big players, then it's the US, the EU, and to some extent Japan and Russia. The EU, with its then 15 member states, but then also anticipating already the growth, had a large share in the emissions. So everybody was very much dependent on the EU actually playing along, which gave the EU a big influence. That influence did not become smaller when the US announced in 2001 that it would leave the Kyoto Protocol process. Because for the Kyoto Protocol now to survive, the EU was essential, and it essentially also had like half of the remaining emissions to be regulated. So it was a crucial player. It was not hegemonic perhaps yet, it couldn't determine everything, but it had a large role to play in the game. Because of that, you can see in Kyoto that it was a core player. In Kyoto there was trilateral negotiations at the end between the US, the EU and Japan. And in the aftermath, when the rules governing the Kyoto Protocol had to be elaborated further on until 2001, the EU even became more important, as I mentioned, with the dropout of the US especially. That context has changed. I mentioned before, developing countries have come on board, have become the subject of discussions, take part in these discussions. It's about global emissions now, it's not about emissions of developed countries only. And in that sense, the share of the EU has become much smaller because of that. But not only because the number of participants has increased, and therefore also the pool of emissions that we look at, but also because the emissions of the EU actually were over time successfully limited and reduced, whereas the emissions in other parts of the world have increased very dramatically. As a result of that, today and already in Copenhagen, the share of EU emissions, the share of those emissions in the global total, is roughly estimated as being somewhere between 10 and 13%, which is quite different from the Kyoto Protocol situation where in the end the EU was half of the emissions to be regulated. So now it's a tenth of the emissions to be regulated. Whereas other players, like China, with a very much rising emission trend, now account for more than 20% of the emissions. And if you take China and the US together, you have a share of more than 40%. So we've basically moved towards a more multipolar world in international climate politics with 1 to 2 heavyweights, the US and China, and a number of more medium-sized weights, to which the EU belongs. So it's still important, but it's perhaps not the crucial player anymore that it used to be before. What does that mean for the EU and what it can do to play a role internationally still? Well, what we have learned is that in these situations, when you are a medium-sized player, you have to reach out to others and you have to try to build coalitions, and that's what the EU has done, after Copenhagen especially. You can't determine what's going on. Your importance for others is limited, although not zero. So you look around for other players so that your weight increases. So that's on the international context that has changed very much. What's also important is what goes on in internal politics and policy making in the EU. That has to do with international credibility. If you want to be a leader in international environmental and climate policy making, you have to have a certain credibility, especially if you lack the power base. The EU, with its market power also, with its big internal market, many actors on the international scene are eager to be linked to that market and have access to it. the EU can give an example and through its regulations also influence what others are doing elsewhere and what happens on the international scene. So in these internal politics, the EU has over time also made significant progress. In Kyoto, back then, there was relatively little internal legislation that the EU had on climate protection. That changed after Kyoto. In the beginning of the 2000s, the EU established a number of legislative instruments, a large variety. The most well-known, obviously, is the EU Emissions Trading Scheme that started operating in 2005 and has since then been the cornerstone of EU climate policy. But it has also adopted other legislation on renewable energy, on energy efficiency, on standards for cars, CO2 emissions of cars, and a whole policy portfolio that has been put in place. Now, that has contributed to some extent to the credibility of the EU. Although one has to say that with the 2020 targets of the EU that were established before Copenhagen, certain problems have occurred since then. So the cornerstone of the EU's credibility in Copenhagen was that it established these 2020 targets, the 20% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 2020, combined with a goal of a share of 20% renewable energy in the final energy consumption by 2020, and the reduction of the consumption of energy in relative terms of 20% also by 2020. The first of these two targets had been put into EU legislation by the time of Copenhagen and indeed certainly supported the EU's stance in Copenhagen. Although, as I said, probably the international context limited that influence because the other players were perhaps not too eager to see whether the EU does 20 or 25% given its emission share. So this credibility has suffered a little bit after Copenhagen because of the financial and economic crisis also that has led to emissions reductions which have brought the EU close to minus 20% already. So in the last couple of years, 2010, 11, 12, we've seen that EU emissions already were at minus 17, minus 18%, a little bit going up and down. And in that context, minus 20% obviously doesn't look that impressive anymore, especially if you then look at the graph and you see that emissions go down until 2011, 2010. And then if you look towards 2020, the emissions more or less stay stable and only go a little bit down anymore over a period of nearly 10 years. That has led to a lot of international criticism of the EU as it could probably be more ambitious. Let's then come to the final point, looking ahead, the 2030 targets and the 2015 Global Climate Agreement. If we look at the international context, it's rather unlikely that that will improve a lot. Emissions in China and other developing countries are still rising. Emissions in the EU are stable and going slowly down. So the structural position in the international constellation of interests roughly remains the same. So for the EU, that means still an emphasis in its strategy and its international strategy on coalition building and reaching out to others. It probably also means with the others growing over time, also the other medium-sized powers, that the EU will be dependent on interests of others also to link up with itself. It can't be expected with its limited power resources to basically push the whole wagon itself. As for leading by example, that is and still remains a major point. But in the current economic and political context, it probably means an emphasis on cost-efficient ambition with co-benefits. There's a lot of scope for that, and it means looking at regulation that fosters structural change that will be required in the long term, because 2030 also is only an interim step towards the full decarbonization of the economies of developed countries that will be required by 2050. So the 2014 communication that the European Commission has put forward on the subject gives us some first hints as to whether the EU will be able to lead by example. The 2014 communication puts forward one target for greenhouse gas emission reductions for 2030, and that target the Commission proposes should be a 40% reduction. Whereas we had a binding target for renewables for 2020 that was then broken down to the member states, the Commission now proposes a 27% target for renewables for 2030, which they call binding, but say should not be binding for the individual member states. One is wondering how that then can be binding. The communication is silent on the third element, energy efficiency, and says that energy efficiency element will be revisited during 2014 when the existing energy efficiency directive will be reviewed. There are some hints in the communication also towards more structural change, instruments that could potentially support that, innovation in industries that may help to bring down greenhouse gas emissions in the longer term and may foster new and innovative technologies in these sectors. So if we now look at the targets that the Commission has proposed, 40% looks quite logical if you're going to decarbonization, which means 80 to 95% by 2050, and you come from 20% in 2020, 40 in 2030. You could see that you are at 60 and 80, 2040, 2050. So that seems logical. However, if you look at the science, as I mentioned before, the science had said that developed countries should be at 25 to 40% in 2020 already, and therefore probably a little bit further in 2030. There's also a certain number of emission allowances in the emissions trading system, etc., that will stay around beyond 2020 and were not used in the past phase. So that ideally one may have wished for a higher target for the EU. But we'll have to see. It may still be the most ambitious that's being put forward by the countries that are negotiating a 2015 agreement. The 27% target for renewables has been criticized, and it's certainly not very ambitious when you think about decarbonization, and that will need a share far beyond 50% of renewables in overall energy consumption in the year 2050. And the lack of action on energy efficiency has also drawn some criticism. Overall, in the international context, as I mentioned, there's a certain likelihood that these targets of the EU would be still at the more ambitious end. The other countries have not come forward with their targets yet. But judging from the discussions that are ongoing, there's a certain likelihood that minus 40% of greenhouse gas emissions would be relatively progressive. But there's a big but at the moment, because what's on the table is the proposals of the European Commission. The next step is that the member states, the European Council in March 2014, but also the European Parliament will have to discuss the communication and the strategy and the targets proposed by the European Commission. And that we'll have to see first before we can make a final assessment where the EU is going and where that will leave it in the international discussions on a 2015 global climate agreement. Thank you very much.